Look, 2023 has not been the best year for movies so far, at least from the ones I've seen. But that means when a good one comes along, it makes it all the more satisfying. What is going on, everyone, and welcome to my review of Insidious The Red Door, the fifth and supposedly final installment in the Insidious franchise. This film is directed by Patrick Wilson, and it stars Patrick Wilson himself as Josh Lambert. It stars Ty Simpkins as Dalton, Rose Byrne, Sinclair Daniel, Andrew Astor, and in some smaller roles, Angus Sampson, Lee Winnell, and Lynn Shay. So if you've been watching my reviews of the Insidious franchise that I've done leading up to this film, you'll know that I'm a big fan of that franchise. Not all of those movies are winners, but for the most part they're pretty good, and that this film in particular was one of my most anticipated films of the year. I went in basically completely blind. All that I knew is that it's another Insidious movie and that they're going to travel into the further again, and I made sure to just avoid all critic scores and stuff like that. The only thing I saw was when I opened up Letterboxd to check to make sure it was in my watch list, and I just saw it was at about a 3 average then, but even then it only had about 1,000 ratings, so it doesn't really matter. So I went in completely blind, not knowing what the critics said, and I just went in just hoping that it would be a good film. So the synopsis of this film reads: to put their demons to rest once and for all, Josh Lambert and a college-aged Dalton must go deeper into the further than ever before, facing their family's dark past and a host of new and more horrifying terrors that lurk behind the Red Door. So starting off with the positives for this thing, and I think that this might actually be the top positive for me, is a mixture of the incredible performances from everyone and the character work. Almost all of these characters were fully realised, and I found it to be extremely satisfying in that department. I really felt for Josh. He's such an excellent character, and he's just played to perfection by Patrick Wilson. I found some of the directions that they take him and his storyline and character growth just to be extremely compelling. He's a vulnerable character, but he's not a weak character, which is one of the that statement in itself is just one of the best things that you can apply to a character. I think you need a character that is vulnerable but not weak, and I loved where they took him. I actually found it really quite moving in some parts. Dalton as well is excellent. Now that he's heading off to college, he's a bit more of a moody teen who's still struggling with shit. He's a bit of an asshole, but his character works for me. It really does. I love where they take him. I love how he kind of grows throughout the movie. I love that not everything's going smoothly for him or his family, and it doesn't feel like it's just being used, like his kind of family struggles and his own personal struggles. It doesn't feel like it's just being used as like this just set the scene. Look, things aren't going well. Root for them. Hopefully things will go better. It actually feels natural, and it made me think back to Insidious Chapter 2. That film I didn't feel it at the time, but thinking about it now after watching this, I think that film wrapped things up a little too cleanly, and there are definitely some questions that had to be answered, and some questions that had to be asked, probably more so. And I think this film does a great job at addressing them and really putting a satisfying closure to the franchise. Rose Byrne was great again. I love where they take her character as well. I thought she didn't have a massive part in the film, but I think it was everything suited her. I thought she was great. I thought where she went was great, and again, harkening back to Insidious 2, there are some things like the way it ends up a little bit too clean. I think this film does a great job at addressing some of those things that were left out in the open. And also, even the side characters I found to be extremely compelling. The character of Chris, who is kind of Dalton's friend that he meets at college, I found her to be so good. At first I thought she was going to be a bit of a burden to the movie as just a bit of a comedic relief sidekick, but I thought she was brilliant. She played a great part in the film, and I was just so happy that we actually had some characters, like side characters, that were not just disposable like they were in Last Key. These characters, almost all of them felt fully realised to me. Even Foster, played by Andrew Astor, who was kind of just forgotten about in the first two movies, even he gets more to do in this film, and I'm so glad that he does, because if they had just ignored him again, it would have been like, okay, this family has a few kids. Like, are they just only going to focus on Dalton? And they don't. I thought that was really, really good. The story in this film was also very interesting, which is one of the main reasons why I love Insidious over so many more haunting movies. And I found it to be interesting. It went in a few different directions that I wasn't expecting. It went in a few directions that really worked for me. Without saying too much, it says in the synopsis the family's horrifying past, which were never really explored that much in the previous films, but I thought it worked really well. The way it kind of resolved Patrick Wilson's character, his own personal demons and what he's facing, and the stuff that he struggled with all of his life, and the way he ends up coming to terms with it, and I think it's just brilliant that it addresses things that are kind of left out in the open in the first movies, that are like, okay, what's going on? What's going on with this character in Patrick Wilson's life? They don't ever really mention him. This film addresses that. It provides a good amount of closure to it, and I felt satisfied with it. Also, I said it earlier, but this film has a really moving and touching emotional core to it that I actually found, like, I was surprised. I was expecting just like a fun, scary movie, but this movie really does have like a deep-rooted core to it. It doesn't boast the most original of themes, but it's so effective at communicating them. It's going back to just more mental illness and stuff like that, and grief and stuff, which is actually funny because I was criticizing The Boogeyman recently for retreading those grounds in a completely unoriginal and uninspired way. This film, Insidious the Red Door, this is how you look at those kind of sensitive topics and explore them in a way that is both moving and somewhat relatable, but also interesting, different, and compelling. I think that this film weaved those themes together brilliantly. And again, I just have to mention how good the acting was, especially from Patrick Wilson. He's so good. He's brilliant. I really like him. He's a great actor, and just, he feels like a grounded person in this movie. Again, vulnerable, but not weak. He's excellent. He feels like someone that you could know. He's brilliant as kind of like a father figure with troubles. I can't express enough how impressed I was with his acting and the writing of his character. Also, speaking of Patrick Wilson, him in the director's chair was excellent. He was so good as the director of this film. He was so much more, he breathed just personality and life back into the franchise compared to Insidious 4, which I just found to be extremely just bland and mediocre and, you know, been there, done that sort of directing. This film, it doesn't completely take over James Wan and Leigh Whannell's brilliant directing styles, but it harkens back to it in a way that I think is effective. The scare sequences are all really well done and really well shot, and I think Patrick Wilson needs to do more in the director's chair because he was just fantastic. And last but certainly not least, the scares in this movie. This movie was creepy. I saw it last night in a theater at night time, and it got to me. There are some sequences that really, really got to me. There was some excellent build-ups, some excellent tension was built throughout the film, and just overall, the scares are iconic and memorable and unique and stuff that I actually haven't seen before. For example, one of the first things you see in a trailer, I'm not going to spoil anything past this, but there's a scene when Patrick Wilson is getting an MRI, and that is one of the most effective scare sequences that I have seen in one of these movies. And I think the way it's built up is brilliant. I think the kind of playing on the fear of having an MRI, being inside this claustrophobic and small tunnel, it was so good. And there was many other scares throughout the movie that were just as good. And I was so happy that this film delivered the creep factor. And also, this film is very entertaining. I never found it boring. I never found it to drag. I found it just to be constant edge of your seat thrills. And when it wasn't edge of your seat thrills, it was actually interesting character work. This movie is entertaining and it is spooky, and I was really satisfied with it. Moving on to some of the mixed aspects that I had with this film. They also have a daughter in the movie, Callie, who was a baby in the first few movies. Now, I get why she wasn't really in this movie, because it could have bogged it down a little bit, but at the same time, what I was saying about Foster's character and how he was so underutilized in the first two movies, she kind of gets the same treatment in this one. I mean, I understand why she didn't have much to do in the first couple of movies, because she was only a baby, but I do think that maybe she could have been in it a little bit more. Maybe she could have been talked about. She could have played a bigger part in it. Circumstances in the movie, which I won't spoil, kind of give reason as to why she wasn't in it as much. And again, she could have bogged down the movie if she was in it too much, but I do think she was in it too little. Moving on to the negatives of this film, this is probably the biggest one for me, and that is the fact that there are a couple of false scares in this movie. And that really disappoints me, because the Insidious franchise, especially the first movie, the reason I consider it to be one of the greatest horror films of all time is because all of the scares are genuine. They all happen for a reason. It's never something stupid like, opening the cupboard and a cat jumps out. It all exists to progress the movie forwards. And this film has a few where it's just like, oh shit, oh, okay, it's just that. For example, someone opens Dalton's dorm room open really quickly while he's thinking about something, and it kind of snaps him out, and you're like, oh no, okay, it's just his friend coming in to say hi. And also, another problem that I had with the movie was the fact that they weren't massive logic issues for me, but the first film had such an ambitious story and delivered on it brilliantly, and I can't find anything that doesn't really make sense about that movie. There are a couple of times in this movie when I'm like, I don't know if that entirely works. There's just some kind of laws around the further that were kind of established to not really work in the first few movies. And I just thought, okay, that's gone a little bit too far for me to entirely take it seriously. I'm doing my best to not spoil it, but that's basically how I felt. I felt sometimes there were some things like, that's kind of established in previous movies to not really work. And finally, for my last negative, the final act of this film does feel a little bit undercooked. Now, that might just be me comparing it to the first movie, because the first movie's final act is just wild. And this film definitely goes places in its final act, but it just felt maybe a little bit rushed. Just a tad, which is a shame, but it wasn't enough to actually ruin the movie for me. And there were definitely some things that happened, and I'm like, okay, that's somewhat convenient. It's not like, complete Deus Ex Machina or anything like that, but there were some times when I'm like, okay, that's a little, that just happened a little bit too easily. It's certainly a solid final act, but it's hard not to compare it back to that first movie, and it's even hard not to compare it back to the rest of the movie when it feels like, it's building up to something so massive, and then it's just like, okay, that was a good final act. It just has some problems. It's probably the weakest part of the film for me. But don't take that as though that's me saying it's bad or anything like that. It's just, I could have done with a little bit more. Overall, guys, while this film definitely doesn't reach the heights of the original film, it's by far my favourite of the sequels. I was so impressed with this film on so many levels. The positives far outweighed the negatives, and I just had a complete blast with it, and I just came home last night just like, fuck yes! Good movie. Love to see it. I'm going to give Insidious The Red Door 4 stars. Thank you so much for watching my review on Insidious The Red Door. I hope you enjoyed the review. I hope you enjoy the movie as well. Let me know what you think of it if you've seen it, although it might not be out for a little while, because I think it actually came out a day or two early in Australia than it did everywhere else. But nonetheless, if you've seen the film, let me know what you think of it, and I will see you all later. Bye.